Researchers believe tidal flooding in Miami and Key West will increase dramatically over the next 15 years. In an attempt to keep flooding to a minimum, the city of Miami Beach has spent $15 million on pumps, and they were tested this week with the annual king tide, which was predicted to send an additional foot of water onto city streets. Taking advantage of this rise in sea level, students from Florida International University's Biscayne Bay campus were on hand to measure and study the flooding in the hopes the data collected will help coastal cities in the future. Joining me to discuss the students' finding, we welcome Juliet Pinto, Associate Professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Florida International University, and Renee Price, Associate Professor in the School of the Environment, Arts and Society at Florida International University. Thank you both for being here. Renee, let me start with you. You are a hydrologist.
That's correct.
What does that mean?
A hydrologist is someone that studies water flow throughout the world. And so that involves oceanography, studying water on the oceans, but it also involves studying freshwater availability on land.
What are king tides?
So it refers to an astronomical event where the Earth and the moon and the sun are all lined up, and it's also when the moon and the sun are closest to the Earth, and it creates extreme high tides.
So high tide, this isn't new. It's not a new phenomenon. Why is it a nuisance now?
Because of sea level rise. So there's always been...
So it's a compounding effect.
Exactly. And so last year when the king tides, they occur predictably in the spring and in the fall. And so we just had one this fall, and the one that was just last spring caused about a foot of water to flood the streets of Miami Beach.
So the relationship to climate change is that it doesn't impact climate change, it just compounds the effect of climate change at one given time. The tide does recede.
Yes, it does. So when there's an extreme high tide, then the following low tide is also an extreme low tide. But you're right, it's a compounding effect, and it's a direct effect of climate change. So as the oceans warm and as more glacial ice on the land melts, it causes the sea level to rise. So on top of that sea level rise, then we have these king tide events.
Tell us about the journalism initiatives being done at FIU, Juliet, that has to do with communicating sea level rise. People talk about climate change and sea level rise. Do they really understand what it means?
Well, that's what we're hoping to help with. So as mass communicators, our goal is to get out important information that the community should have that maybe they're not aware of. And for us, that involves sea level rise. So for journalism faculty from FIU School of Journalism and Mass Communication, we're awarded a grant from the Online News Association, which we called Eyes on the Rise. And that involved taking students to experience sea level rise in different ways, and one of which included the king tide.
What was the students' response and reactions?
I think they had a very interesting field trip. So certainly our own students, we wanted to get the journalism students around the sensors, the measuring, the process of what we called crowd hydrology. And we wanted to get the marine science students around the process of reporting on that and what we're calling sensor journalism. So how data can tell really important, interesting stories.
What's crowd hydrology?
Crowd hydrology is getting people to get engaged and involved around the process of studying water flow around the world. And so we had students from Mast Academy as well as students from other high schools around Florida who were using sensors to look at the floodwater, to look at the water in the bay, to measure it for different things. And then they're now in the process of analyzing over 100 samples. And then from that data, we are going to tell stories.
So how difficult is it for the students who aren't scientists to be able to tell this story?
Well, something interesting when you pair up crowd hydrology with sensor journalism is that journalism and hard science really have a lot of parallels in that they both start with a question. Everyone has a question that they want to answer, and they go out and they collect the best possible information from the most credible sources that they can, and then they come to conclusions. How they communicate those conclusions are different, as Renee and I know, so we are pairing this up to try to get both sides experience in these processes.
So Renee, you and I were speaking before starting this segment that for scientists it's very different communicating to non-scientists, and there's a jargon and there's a level of understanding that's obviously very different. How was the experience with you working with these students?
Oh, it was just fabulous to see the high school students talking about science. They were using words of glacial melting and albedo and sea level rise, and it was just wonderful to see them. And
so what do you think, as a scientist, what was the takeaway of this week's activities for you?
For me, it was how we can communicate our science to the general public, and I think this crowd hydrology project is a great medium and a great way to do that.
And I think, to some degree too, environmental sciences, when you get into the issue of climate change, it's become very politicized. And so when it becomes politicized, the scientific information gets manipulated and sidebarred for different reasons. It's difficult to be able to just get to what's actually going on. What is actually going on in South Florida regarding climate change?
So our biggest effect right now is sea level rise that we're trying to deal with. There's many places along the coastline that are very low lying. Our land surface is very flat. So not only when the sea level rise, it leaves less place for the fresh water to run off the land. And so when we get a lot of rains, if we get a lot of tropical storms that drop a lot of rain on the surface, it doesn't have a lot of place for it to go. So we get freshwater flooding from the rain events more frequently due to sea level rise. And so people don't understand that. We get sea level rise not only affects people on the coast, but it also affects people inland as well.
When you say inland, how far inland?
All the way to the Everglades.
So that means from the Atlantic Ocean
from one coast
to the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. The entire peninsula is being affected by it.
So what is the future for South Florida regarding climate change? I mean, when you want to say, look at where can South Florida be 40 years from now? Best scenario, worst scenario?
40 years from now, we hope to see less than a foot of sea level rise. I think that's what we're hoping for, but it could be more. We're hoping to deal with inches at that point. And as long as sea level continues to rise steadily or slowly, we can adapt. And I believe we can adapt. We have the technology and the means and the solutions.
So how do you adapt? What do you do to adapt? Create physical barriers? Filtration systems?
We have physical barriers now in the means of locks on our canals to keep sea water from coming up the canals and contaminating our water supply. We may need to have bigger locks and barriers on those canals. Fixing our stormwater drains so that they don't necessarily drain to the ocean. Now we're trying to get them to go to the wastewater treatment plants, and they're being treated, and then we're pumping them down, deep down into below our drinking water supply aquifers.
Juliet, the tide in king tide didn't go as high as some had expected. Were the students disappointed?
Oh, not at all. The goal was not to, go out and say, look at all this flooding. The goal was to engage our students around this process, this phenomenon, both in terms of what a king tide is, how it relates to sea level rise, how we can test it, and how we can tell stories about it. We were actually all just so pleased to see that Miami Beach had taken such a progressive stance and put in all of that infrastructure that really kept the streets dry. I was there last year and it looked nothing like that. It was flooded in that exact area. So our focus was not on whether it was going to flood or not flood.
What particular area of Miami Beach were you on?
The press event was held on 18th and Purdy. So down by the Venetian Causeway, and then we had student teams going all around West Avenue and Alton Road, which traditionally have flooded during the king tides. And they were sampling floodwaters here and there, but the press event was down by Barry Gibbs Park, and we had the EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy there. We had Senator Bill Nelson. We had Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, Mayor of Miami Beach Philip Levine, and Mayor of Cindy Lerner. So we had quite a lineup of people to talk about what was happening and what's in the future for all of us. So.
And the response from Senator Nelson, for example, and Mayor Levine, what was their response?
Well, they said, this is the issue of our time for South Florida, and we really need to start working on, getting the political leadership and will, we have it at local levels, but, we need to start thinking about how we can make good decisions, down the road.
So what's been the biggest pushback in accomplishing these goals? Funding? Would it be funding, or not having planned and prepared for it?
We are planning and preparing for it now. I think it is funding maybe on the federal level and also on the state level. I think if the state, just politicians recognize that we have this problem. Our own governor doesn't even recognize that we have a sea level rise problem, and the entire state is a peninsula surrounded by marine waters. So I think that's our blockage.
Why do you say the governor doesn't recognize it? Because he's not allocating specific funds, or what?
He doesn't believe in climate change, and he doesn't see sea level as a threat to the economy of Florida.
Well, I guess Miami Beach shows an example that perhaps the infrastructure repairs that have been made, as Juliet discussed in the last year, really had a profound effect, and perhaps that's why there was minimal amount of damage, if any at all, to Miami Beach this time around with king tide.
Right. Well, they got engineers on board to analyze their solutions. They put check valves in their stormwater drains, and then they put in the pumps to catch any water that happened to go onto the streets.
Does that have to be done in all municipalities?
It has to be looked at in all municipalities, for sure.
And if you don't, I mean, you said that we're talking about the next few years. We're not too late. We're still at a good time to be able to implement this.
Yes, I agree. And FIU in particular is starting to form a sea level rise institute made up of scientists and lawyers and engineers, and get these group of people together to find solutions for South Florida.
Julia, data tells a story. So what do you think the story that's going to be told is going to say?
Well, I couldn't possibly say. I'm just really looking forward to seeing the results of what these students have done, and getting their feedback on what this experience meant for them. And once we have their results, we can move ahead and tell the entire story of King Tide Day that maybe is not being told yet because of the flooding. It's invisible, it's incremental, so that remains to be done.
And that's why in some cases it's a very difficult story to tell. But how are these students going to tell the story? Through video? Is it going to be written? Through blogs? How is that going to be told?
All of it. All of the above. So I know Kate McMillan, who's a member of our team, she has, I believe, 10 teams working on creating packages and different types of videos. We're also doing written stuff. We have a website for digital features and photography. It's called eyesontherise.org. So all of the above we're working on.
Excellent. I'd like to thank both of my guests for joining me today. Thank you, ladies. Associate Professor in the School of the Environment, Arts and Society at Florida International University. Thank you both for being here. Renee, let me start with you. You are a hydrologist.
That's correct.
What does that mean?
A hydrologist is someone that studies water flow throughout the world. And so that involves oceanography, studying water on the oceans, but it also involves studying freshwater availability on land. And so last year, when the king tides, they occur predictably in the spring and in the fall. And so we just had one this fall, and the one that was just last spring caused about a foot of water to flood the streets of Miami Beach.
So the relationship to climate change is that it doesn't impact climate change, it just compounds the effect of climate change at one given time. The advantage of this rise in sea level, students from Florida International University's Biscayne Bay campus were on hand to measure and study the flooding in the hopes the data collected will help coastal cities in the future. Joining me to discuss the students' finding, we welcome Juliet Pinto, Associate Professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Florida International University, and Renee Price. Researchers believe tidal flooding in Miami and Key West will increase dramatically over the next 15 years. In an attempt to keep flooding to a minimum, the city of Miami Beach has spent $15 million on pumps, and they were tested this week with the annual king tide, which was predicted to send an additional foot of water onto city streets. Taking it, what are king tides?
So it refers to an astronomical event where the Earth and the moon and the sun are all lined up, and it's also when the moon and the sun are closest to the Earth, and it creates extreme high tides.
So high tide, this isn't new. It's not a new phenomenon. Why is it a nuisance now?
Because of sea level rise. So there's always been...
So it's a compounding effect.
Exactly.